Thanks for coming along Saturday night. Rascal, do you want to ask your first question? Or?
I could do. You've put out 5 books in the last 2 years, so there's a lot coming out.
Probably 3 years or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, like, is this interfering? This is my kind of. I won't be able to hear you now. No, I'm in monoland, so I'll put it back in. No, really, what's happened is I'm with the PM Press, which people here would know. PM Press, like AK Press, is founded by Ramsey Kelman, and a lot of people here will remember Ramsey from like 40 years ago and so on. And Ramsey was based in Stirling and in Edinburgh. So for myself, it was the potential for being able to work more in terms of what I wanted to do myself. There was a Scottish publisher, one who was keen to publish a new novel and would accept a collection of stories, but that was it, finished. And another publisher hoped I would maybe do an autobiography. But none of that really interested me because it was the other work that I had around, you know. Those of us from the days of the Free Uni and from the 1980s who were involved in organising the event in 1990 with Noam Chomsky, we'd wanted to put together a book of the event. And Malcolm, who was here earlier, had filmed the event. Much of it's online, by the way. We had wanted to put together a book, and Ramsey himself, in fact, was going to be one of the editors with a couple of other people. But it was very difficult to do, and it never really... It never got beyond that stage, really, of talking. And a couple of people did do things related to it. But it wasn't really... nothing came out of it, anyway, put it that way. So I had most of that stuff myself, and I still was in touch with Noam Chomsky, and there was so much. It just seemed a shame that this stuff was not really out there, which included, although it was my correspondence, personal correspondence, it was also because we were like a loose collection, you might say, of people who were trying to put together the event. So, including a couple of people in this room just now. So, it was also to have the record of it. You know, that was why I felt it was important to make it a book that the UK proceeds towards myself would be going towards the spirit of revolt, rather than some personal thing. It was just to make it, because that's how I viewed it. What happened, it was much more than Noam Chomsky. It included George Davy, the great Scottish philosopher, and so many others. John La Rose had come up from London, and so many, Mandla Langer from the ANC, and a great poet. 3 people had come from the 1982 Leningrad group, and this was just a month after the wall had come down, so it was so difficult for them to make it. It was such a kind of great event, and there were inquiries also from Lithuania. The very fact we had Chomsky, that in itself was, because one of the things it did was it showed up the kind of factionalism that goes on that still goes on in Scotland, you know, amongst the left as well as like anywhere else, the media. That Chomsky did get in touch with a couple of other organisations who had been inviting him for several years, and he says, "Well, I'm coming to do this thing." And he named who we were, and he said, "We're not touching you with a barge pole. They're a bunch of fucking anarchists and and various other things, and would not." So Chomsky was actually prepared to go and do a thing for nothing, and we had paid his expenses to get there. So they wouldn't take Chomsky for nothing, simply because we had organised it. But there was so much involved in that we felt it was important to. Well, I spoke about it with him, that it was important just to get that record as best as we could. You know, you can't do it as well as you could, so at least do something. And really, we felt it would be better than that. And that was why the book really came about, you know. But nobody else would have been interested. I don't know. Maybe AK would have been, you know, at that time. But apart from, I can't think of any publisher in Scotland that would have wanted to take on that and the other stuff I was doing relating to the Kurdish situation and so on, or the anti-racist struggles from the 1980s. There wasn't, no one had any interest, or rather, they didn't want to publish it, put it that way. So
I thought it might be interesting just to go back briefly to 1990, but also some of the questions around self-determination that came up 10 years ago with the independence referendum and the book that you put out, which was whatever 2 years ago, and like just how you some of those arguments and how you cut across it, how you see it, because I think it came out very strongly in the independence question that there is a whole load of ways that we can talk about self-determination, and we should, that has nothing to do with the nation and the nation state.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, definitely that was, these discussions and arguments, in a sense, a logical argument, that they were all around, and they were also pretty much the backbone of the event itself, because we had people from different liberation groups who were attending, you know. So some of them would kind of, you know, they'd a lot to contribute that. It seemed to some of us that people here were not dealing with. You know, they were dealing with some idea of potential independence. It seemed not to understand what was going on in the world. I would say that even if I was critical of the earlier meeting today, it was you feel, look, the world is not like that. You know, in order to talk about self-determination, you have to talk about taking on Lockheed Martin or something like this. There's no point in talking in this way, or as though that kind of relationship between the state and global capital, and especially maybe the defence industry, as if somehow you can walk in to some place in Scotland and make political decisions that are going to carry the board. You know, oh, we're getting rid of Trident. You know, fucking. I mean, it's kind of silly, you know. It's worthwhile made. The only worth value in a sense is because it maybe gets the discussion aired. But to go further than that, the more into you go, the more kind of the history of that particular movement is. You know, I'm thinking. I'm pointing to Glasgow because I'm thinking here of the former Yugoslavia. You know, the situation that maybe the countries in Yugoslavia and Yugoslavia itself were faced with when people wanted they wanted to cut adrift from Stalin. I mean, you know, it's not because people wanted to cease being good socialists, libertarian socialists, or communists. These arguments were the same around then. People here in Scotland knew about them. They knew about them in 1920 because they met each other when just before the formation of Comintern, when Lenin had invited people. People came from all over the world. All these representatives from liberation struggles from everywhere they came. Willie Gallagher came from here with John S. Clark. Sylvia Pankhurst came with Helen Crawford. Other people came from all over, you know, with all these tremendous views about self-determination revolution and coming out of the radical movement from the 19th century. And here they were, and they'd already experienced the formation of the BSP, the early Communist Party, with some great revolutionaries here in Glasgow, Arthur McManus, Tom Bell, and all the people around the time. Poor old McLean was basically in prison all the time. He couldn't even get out of prison. So you had all this tremendous kind of people who were aware of these issues about so-called internationalism, what it takes for revolution. Here we are, 1917, and this thing had just happened. The most natural thing in the world, in a sense, was this is why I was stressing, trying to distinguish between solidarity and internationalism. Internationalism, in that sense, for me, is doing well if it ever recognises the primacy of the local struggle. And if they can't do that, I just feel eventually it's not a view of mine. It's just, to me, it's just that's the reality. Everywhere you look, like if people are in struggle, that's the reality. It's not because it's So the first thing you do is show solidarity. You don't walk in and tell them they're in the wrong struggle or something like that. That's the. So that for me was these kind of issues around what's the reality people are having to deal with. What is that? You have to look at that kind of thing. If you can't deal with reality at a certain level, self-determination, to my mind, eventually just became. I mean, I wasn't SNP in that sense ever. I just couldn't have. Fucking God Save a Queen or something. I mean, for goodness sake, how could you be SNP? It's like being left wing like George Galloway or Jeremy Corbyn, and you have to sing God Save a Queen or something, but so anyway. So but it's the deeper you go into it, in other words, the more education you take on yourself and that awareness of what's going on in other movements, it leaves you unable to go forward unless you can take account of the experience of other people. Here's the experience of, this is what happened. The PKK was mentioned earlier today. This is what happened to the PKK. Öcalan's still in prison. Here we are. What is it? How long has he been in prison? 26 years. I mean, this is the reality. Why are the PKK, it's a terrorist group? Well, it's not. It's a liberation struggle like the ANC. You have to remember, how did they become a terrorist organisation? Because the state powers described them as such. That's why. It's not because they're committing acts of fucking hell, acts of terror. What are you talking about at all? So it's becoming aware of that type of issue, and the PKK is a good example in a sense, or the Kurdish struggle, because it was my first kind of main big involvement, I would say, apart from like the anti-racist movement and trade union activities. I was seeing how relevant that was to the situation in this little country, in Scotland. And what was an interesting thing for me to discover was that PKK and people in Kurdistan were looking at Scotland. Öcalan was looking, and the people around the PKK at that level were looking at the situation in Scotland because they could identify with the clan system and the different languages, and trying to draw a people together that seemed to be. They would all have agreed that they were Scottish or Kurdish, but could hardly stomach to sit beside one another. These issues that were really difficult for Kurdish people still to deal with. And in order for us to actually even understand anything about it, it takes you into having to try and understand what is the situation in the Middle East. And you come to realise after a certain point that the breakup of the Ottoman Empire has been so crucial, as it still is, because of what's happened in the Middle East. And
And in the Balkans.
and in the Balkans, sure. You know, so it's not facing. It's like no. I don't understand why people don't want to face up to the complexity of it. I can understand it at an emotional level. Somehow it's just too much. Somehow, but there's no need to try and take on everything. You know, just pay attention to what's round about you.
But that's a lot of the time you speak to people and you ask them what they do, and they start going on about trying to make people's lives a bit better and stuff like that. But there's no idea any kind of, like the movement. People are looking, instead of looking for a place in the movement, they're looking for the movement's place in them. It becomes a kind of lifestyle. They know there's a lot of shit happening in the world, and they need to do something about it. So let's find something that suits my lifestyle, and I'm going to do that. And it really doesn't. A lot of it's about moving sideways, and moving forward, because there's no vision about where we're going. And people don't understand you need to be part of a movement, and you need to know the next thing you're going to do is going to take you forward in that movement. And we're going to need all these working class people. When you go to places like Govan and stuff now, people are so ignorant of what's going on and depoliticised and stuff. I don't know what it is. I don't think anybody knows, but it's definitely this kind of thing. Most of the work that's getting done is cultural change. It's making people's lives a bit better and stuff like that. But we really need to start talking about institutional change. Like the banks, the corporations and stuff like that. And the only way we're going to shift that is if we get working class people to join that struggle again.
I personally don't see that, Bob. I mean, again, just it's when you look at the hold that global capital has, and the formations that have come about during the last 40 or 50 years, and the nature of what's happened in the international politics. So when you look at, I wasn't at the police thing today, but I do know about earlier police state things that were happening immediately after the Second World War. So just say, for example, what happened in the Glasgow war. People are here, like Joe and our generation, know what happened in Castle Meldrum Chapel, Easter House and so on in the 1960s. We know about, it sounds very far-fetched to talk about it, but that was you can say it for short CIA policy or whatever, World Forum features and all of that, these formations from the 1950s. Well, they carried through in the 60s, but when you look at some of what happened in the 60s, towards the late 60s because of Vietnam, and what you look at what happened from 1969, 1970, around that period, in terms of the breakup of British Empire countries like, especially Kenya, and what happened to the people who were in control there. This is in one of the State is the Enemy kind of book, but it was to try and kind of explore that and let people see that, these people became in charge of the British Army in Northern Ireland. These were the ones. It was the Kitson basically ended up running the British Army, and he ran the British Army. He only died about a year ago or something. Yeah. It was his troops that took on the miners, the Asian community down in Southall in 1979, and all these struggles that took on all the people around the Mango 9. Was it Mango 9?
Mangrove 9.
What was the big fire again? Over in New Cross, the New Cross massacre. Now, in 1981, John LaRose and they marched over the Blackfriars Bridge over in London. The guy who was in charge of that was Kitson. Kitson was second in command in Kenya. And the guy who was in charge when Kenya split, he became in charge of the Bahrain secret police for 30 fucking years. Scottish guy. We can all be proud of him. Ian Henderson, is his name. 30, you know, and he was the butcher in Kenya. These are the things that John LaRose knew that, by the way. When I remember him telling us that in 1981, when they were talking about it, the organisers of the march were talking how to do it. Some of the young squad would want to carry guns, and because they knew what they were going to be met with by, you know, the police had been basically transformed into a kind of a military, domestic army, basically, because the whole way had altered. You know, people like, you know, obviously Ted East, the obvious guy, because he's on record as the goal is we need to be able to kill our own people. That was how can we kill our own people? These were the questions that we were dealing with. You know, that was like let's call them terrorists. Oh, well, if we can call them terrorists, then we can kill them. That's how you transform the local population into the enemy. You know. Anyway, these kind of questions that John LaRose knew that background to Kitson, and said, look, if you go there with guns, then you're going to take on Kitson. That's what you'll be doing, you know. So that type of making people face up to the reality of where you are right now. People that had come out of these former, you could call it British Commonwealth or British Empire, they were meeting people in what do you call it? Let's call it the White House. They were people who were actually talking about how do we fight wars in Southeast Asia? What's the best way of doing this? How do we take on indigenous communities? How do we deal with, in terms of just say the Middle East? Okay, we control Bahrain. Let's form an upper class, and we'll give them Iraq as long as we keep control of the oil fields there, Mostar and places like that. You know, how do we control Iran? How do we find a way down there? All of these kind of issues they actually came out of like 1916, 17 questions that were being formed even before the 1917 revolution. It was just like the 1917 revolution changed the way they looked at it a bit. But it just gave greater pickings for people like France. Oh, France, you could have Syria. You know, all these kind of things that were going on, you know. So until you face up to these issues, it's very hard to kind of take questions about self-determination in Scotland seriously. You go, well, is it only 2 years ago that Lockheed Martin built this space aerodrome in the Shetlands? I mean, for Christ's sake, the rockets to the moon going up from the Shetlands. Go to Lockheed Martin and say, get out of our country. I mean, this is the same outfit that, like, the Caribbean Initiative back in, like, what was that, in the Caribbean? It was Morris Bishop, when they assassinated Bishop. It was basically to test helicopters for Lockheed Martin. They went in there, and they had what they call the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which was supposed to be an economic deal with USA. About 8 of these countries, they've all got the same monarch. Guess who it is? You know, the Caribbean Initiative are there's all these 9 or 10 or 11 West Indian countries, and we'll all come together with the US, and we've come to a decision. Who are they all? Oh, fucking Bermuda. Oh, aye, okay. And they've all got the same. Queen Elizabeth was all their monarch, you know. Oh, well, we've all got together and decided that Bishop's got to go. And Lockheed will send in other helicopters, and that's their advertising slogans these days. You know, we sorted out Operation Desert Fury. We sorted out the West Indies with these helicopters. It's great. You go anywhere and you can, and they advertise them to go along the Syrian border as well. You know, let's send them into we'll go right along Rojava and we can take care, we can go right into northern Iraq and we'll have these friends there amongst the Kurdish people there. And we have these two horrible Kurdish families. This takes you back to wherever it was in the first place. Campbells and Mackenzies, here we are with the big families in Iran and the big families in Iraq and so on, the clans. You can understand why the Kurdish movement were interested in, you know, apart from that divergence. Anyway, everybody's flabbergasted.
No, you have a great thumbnail sketch in the state is the enemy of Queen Elizabeth, and you say she must have known, as a human being, she must have known.
Oh yeah.
That's
Yeah.
I think it's really good to bring it back home.
Yeah, there's no. Yeah, of course that was the case. You know, because she was in Kenya when she heard she had to fly home because her dad was dead. So. Yeah, so they were there shooting elephants or whatever the hell it was. Because Kenya was like parts of the west coast of Scotland, you know. It was, you went to Kenya, people go to Kenya in November. In August they go to Scotland or they go to the Hebrides, you know, because everyone's got a wee season, you know, so the upper classes have these places they go at certain times of year, as we know. So she was in Kenya because it was the elephant killing season. And then it'd be Balmoral and they would shoot the peasants. Oh no, the pheasants. Yeah, anyway.
That was quite a wee journey we went on.
Ah, I know. That's internationalism.
I don't know when I got lost. I think it was in about.
It's crossing from Govan to Partick was a big deal for me.
Not anymore. I got a new bridge here. So I'm living Govan and cycle to the university now.
Well, we were talking earlier about Glasgow and Bob, but it would be nice just if people want to come in with it,
Yeah.
open things out, you know.
Yeah, I was going to say
you know.
we just wanted to start it off, and we're happy to
So a lot of ground covered.
point at people. Yeah,
Well,
please.
since you opened with kind of sort of the question of Scottish self-determination, I remember it was maybe about a year after the referendum in Scotland, and my understanding we did an interview with you where I think we both wanted to talk about literature, but you forced us to do it more in politics. And you said to me the best thing ever about Scottish independence, because I asked you, do you think Scottish independence will happen? And you said, yes, but it might take 2,000 years. Do you feel more or less optimistic? What are you fighting for?
Well, you know, one of the things about it is you become aware of, it's like, it's being aware of the power of the institution and what people have to cope with every day of their life, and you realise that so much of society is based around the continued existence of things as they are, the ruling class as they are, or the ruling elite. I think Chomsky's that kind of distinction is a good one, like to distinguish between ruling elite and ruling class. The ruling elite, for me, then it brings in like the state. It brings in the higher people within the state. Then we can talk about the heads of the various, the military and so on, or whoever, and get to the big global concerns. Well, I'd mentioned earlier the World Economic Forum that is now pretty prevalent, and they control, their control on things is, and the thing is also is it's so blatant. They don't even bother kind of hiding stuff really in a way. It's, they come out and say things that you think it's almighty, you know. The need to get rid of, it's not even the need to get rid of democracy, it's the relevance of all of that, and why they make it a kind of ethical decision. They bring in kind of, they have a young squad. This WEF, it's like a young Communist Party or something. They call them, like, what the hell do they call them? Something like, anyway, it's young people. It's to try and give them an ideology. because they figure most young people need an ideology, even the far right, you know, or the far right economic kind of, which is not Nazism or anything, but it needs to be something. So they have a kind of, it reminds me when my grandson was into Andrew Tate, they have this sort of ethics based in the Old Testament or something like that. It's a really weird form of Christianity, except you realise it's quite close at home, you know, since my grandmother's people were from Lewis. It reminds me of like going to Stornoway or something. You know, they're really people who are really the worst kind of fundamentalists, really.
But it's the same with the NATO young crop, with
Yeah.
the Atlanticists. They've been breeding these people like Sanna Marin, Kaya Kallas, and so on, and they are now taking these like Annalena Baerbock,
Yeah.
and they're now taking these positions, and they can come out with the CIA line of like, oh, we need to break up Russia.
Yeah.
Russia's too big, for instance. We need to break it up into smaller republics. It would be good if it was more manageable. There was more self-determination for the different people. All of it. It's kind of.
Well, it is, but it leaves, again, when we talk about Ukraine and Russia like that, too, it's like some of the reality. I mean, anyone here in touch with people from parts of Africa, I was a guy I know who's very much involved from Sudan, you know, but you're in this situation again where you have people who are dealing with the reality of the so-called civil war. One civil war, the civil war, one side is composed of mercenaries and one side is composed of the people. I mean, how many times you have to see this without recognising what's going on? You don't have to go back to Nicaragua or Central or South America in order to see the setup that's going on. You know, we know that that's the situation in Sudan. The mercenaries fighting in Sudan are the same mercenaries, mercenary control as is happening in the Ukraine-Russian war. None of the, you can find these things out just by looking, like, do a bit of research. None of that is ever going to be given a proper sort of like discussion in a sense. It's very hard to get. This is what we tried to do many years ago with the Free University, was to try and get some of those basic questions so we could actually be equipped to even just talk about it. You know, like talk about these things, or, you know, and it's become harder, you know, in a sense. You have to know about a thing to begin with it, you know. So you're back in, I don't feel any kind of any sort of depressed thing about it, but it drives me personally into being more aware of radical history, and being aware of issues that it never seemed to occur to me before. That all working class history is radical history. That every struggle is part of radical history. The women's movement is part of radical history. Every single history that is not the history of the ruling elite is radical history. And in order to get to grips with it, you have to do research. You talk to people from who are involved in other struggles, and, you know, like, because of me being a writer and having a political profile, I found myself in company with other writers and campaigners and activists who were in struggle. And they would kind of look at you when you were talking, because it was evident to them you didn't really understand what was going on. And usually the people would be too polite to say it to you. And also, one of the things I picked up very early myself, because it would come about through having a couple of pints with people who were involved in the struggles, when I would get quite critical, you know, and they would remind, in particular, it was, say, in anti-racist struggles, you know, if you come, I'll be blunt about it, the ANC, I had a couple of friends who were in ANC. So how could you be involved in the ANC and not be involved in anti-racist issues here? What's going on, or why? And I would say the same to other people that I was from other parts of the world I was in touch with. And gradually you come to realise that the difficulties of being within the diaspora, when you're basically in a situation of political asylum, as soon as you do something, you're out. And there's and your own kind of people will be saying, you really can't, you go and sit in cafes and talk politics, don't get involved. There are these issues why people might want to, and it's like being placed in a hypocritical situation, not by intention, but not being allowed to be political, and it was me realising that that over the years, I realised that, in fact, when I was dealing with it, my first connection with the Kurdish movement, which was Iraqis, it was not people from Turkey. Because there were some big issues on at that time, and I felt that they were not being addressed by groups that were here, that were in the UK, and felt it was important to address them. In the same way that I didn't want to hear about any trade union who supported any issue outside of the UK, because it's like, why are you not supporting your own workers? It's so easy for a trade union to go and support PKK or go and support ANC. Why is it you're telling us not to go and strike? Forget that. It's the easiest thing in the world to go and give solidarity from a trade union leadership to people in a different struggle. But why can't you show solidarity with your own workers? There's an unofficial strike there. Why are you telling them to go back to work? Then you're telling us you're going to go and support whoever the fuck it is. That kind of thing is just like, don't get, no. But one of the things that comes out of that, for myself, is the importance of diaspora politics, and to me that is not being addressed properly. And that, I think, is the key link between so-called internationalism and areas of solidarity, is to find out, is almost like explore diaspora politics. I look around and go, how many people from the different cultures and communities in Glasgow are here tonight or have been here during the day? Does it not concern you? Do these issues not concern you? How can you not reach people who are in constant fear of what the police are going to do at 2 o'clock in the morning? So there's all these types of issues. But that solidarity became so. For example, let us talk. If we stay with anti-racist movement, you go look at the solidarity that came about through the anti-racist movement and what was going on in Northern Ireland between Sinn Féin at that period and between the hunger strikers and so on. That became that recognition. Because how can you ignore the reality of a community that are under that type of stress, that type of being beaten down by the cops and by the state? We know that look what happened to, what do you call him, the lawyer in Northern Ireland. Pat Finucane. Well, we know because it's actually been confessed. These things were confessed by the people who were in the murder gang, and it was just a murder. It was a straightforward kits and murder gang. That's what they had in Kenya. That was part of what the British state used for years to cage. Yeah.
Yeah, cheers. I totally agree. I was wondering. It sounds like you're saying 1990 was a moment where some of that diaspora politics was present. In some ways, like from the way you described it, so I was really interested. I wondered if you had other examples of times where that has been present in like organising around Glasgow, where you feel like that has happened and people have come together. Because I totally agree, that's quite vital. But then I also just wondered if you could say a bit more about what you were alluding to in terms of Drum Chapel and Castle Milk, because I don't know, like, I was in the policing chat earlier, it was really interesting, but one of the big things was there's just not much information about undercover and just general, you know, police violence, police racism in Scotland, because the inquiry that's going on now isn't actually covering Scotland, for instance. So I didn't quite get the reference, so I just wondered if you could...
One of the things was it was infiltration by people. It was, or you could call it like, it was the recognition by Anglo-American interests, put it that way, that it was important to reach the minds.
Right.
And of like young people, especially ideological, and also we need. It was like we need to get some writers and artists and musicians on board here. We can't, because at the moment it seems as if they're all radical, you know. So we need to get artists and writers and musicians who they can be as radical as they like in their art, but politically we need them to be aligned with the so-called right wing, you know. So I know, I mean, that part of that again was to do with community art. Here in Scotland, it was anywhere where there was a heavy presence of gangs and so on. So there was community money was going towards the most famous one in East would be Easter House with Frankie Vaughan, the musician at that time, you know. So he would be that period where people were being kind of bussed in from outside to tell the young people there was another way apart from gangs, that, you know, they could be involved in different things. And some of the activists that were around in the 60s, they were still around, a bit older than myself, you know, but including people like Freddie Anderson, John and Tommy and Bob, and people will remember Freddie Anderson, people who did really good work in Easter House, and out of it, they were aware of what was going on, but they also knew that they could organise stuff, you know. So like Freddie could put on maybe Crassivay playing John McLean and so on, and that was where Gary Lewis and a younger squad like Gary Lewis and others started to be involved in acting, because they were just ordinary young folk around. The same in, I don't know, in Drumchapel there were musicians and so on around, a bit older than me. Here, people like George Gallagher and that. I mean, the bands in Scotland at that time in Glasgow were really quite phenomenal, as they were in places like Liverpool and London, Newcastle, Birmingham, and so on. They were also organising literary magazines and journals, like the famous ones would be The Economist at that time, and they had other ones that, guys, I can't. Some of them are really well known, and they had sort of right-wing philosophers and writers, a lot of right-wing writers, you know, an awful lot of them. So they were like writing all the time in these magazines and probably getting paid decent sums of dough. Those of us who wanted to publish in a right-wing magazine secretly weren't invited, you know. But it was actual projects, but they didn't kind of last as long as all that, because ultimately I think in some ways there was a corruption of that in the mid-60s too, in terms of, the most obvious in terms of music, you know. So and eventually it degenerated into what you might call hippiedom, or whereas it'd been quite a radical working class music scene in the UK that was really exciting, you know, the Animals and Small Faces and bands like that. But eventually that was lost to like something else, you know. But so that was actually part of a whole kind of, you might slapped down by the authorities that happened. And coming out of that period, 66, 67, 68, it's really, when you look at what was happening at that point, you get into like the politics and African American politics and so on. Some of it was, things like George Jackson. Even when Bob Dylan was doing a couple of songs in relation to that, these were generally a political period. There's no question that would have disturbed the authorities. There's just no question that that would have happened. So the fight back from that period is it's quite straightforward once you start to look at it and once you start to research on the period. You know, I know that I could sit here and talk to people of my generation that would know about that, and that includes Ochilin, who's a year younger than me, because they can talk about what was happening in places like Argentina and Uruguay and Miami and places like that in terms of what was going on in the US. They can talk in the same way about what's going on in the Middle East and around, you know. But to get that same level of being able to discuss reality, talk about reality here in Scotland or in England, Wales or Ireland is difficult. Easier in Ireland. You get that in Ireland, you know, but it's hard to get there. For people coming in from other politics, it's like a never land of discussing these issues again. You're back into that self-determination. So when it was part of getting Chomsky, it was to try to get people to be aware of what that reality might be. And the other side, of course, bringing in George David, the intellectual side, was to show also people that you don't even know your own intellectual history here. You don't actually you don't know the political, I mean, we tried to, I mean, Malcolm was here earlier, Malcolm Dixon, not. And another thing we tried to do, Guy and John and Tommy, you remember, was draw together generations at that period, you know. So we would have people and try and bring together like the Bobby Lynn generation, which again is just like my father's generation, Hughie Savage, Les Foster, Ned Donaldson, Ned who went to Yugoslavia during the Second World War. Because he was undercover, as you remember Ned well, but he was undercover for a Young Communist Party. So he was to go there and report back. But of course he went there, and the people he met in Yugoslavia just changed. Ned came back, and along with Les Foster and Hughie Savage and Harry McShane, they left the CP. So that would have been 1951, around that period, you know.
I was wondering if you wanted to say a few words about the common sense tradition that George Davey draws from and kind of...
Yeah, I mean, if people...
just a few words, because I don't know how much people know, and also like how do you feel about it now? And
Well, it's still kind of... The left were always very, very wary of it here. When you introduced it here, the left would run away from it because they regarded it as quite a right-wing thing, and they took, you might call it the worst side of, what you say, Adam Smith or something like that. Especially Adam Smith. But they wouldn't see the power of what the philosophical position was, which was, and again, it was an 18th century philosopher. So the type of politics that were going on at that period married with the philosophical position, or the intellectual position, which was also, you could say, that was the position that influenced Marx. So when Marx talks about the Scottish economists, he's basically talking about that group. But Adam Smith, you might say, looking back, if you see the context, the problem, the Adam Smith position, in a sense, it can be rediscovered as it was by people like McShane and that American philosopher.
Chomsky's still quoting him, Adam Smith. He's always going on about Adam Smith.
Well, because it was Adam Smith, it was his theory of perception that became... I want to find a place for David Hume here. That's basically why. Yes. And if you're left with Adam Smith, it seems to be rejecting like David Hume. But the great thing was that Adam Smith's position was also based on the necessity of the poor to have a perception and to have a view of things and a position. So if you stay with that old idea of the social contract, you know, that money will find his position somehow. He would have been thinking it was a very liberal kind of position. It would be based between the rich and the poor. as though somehow the poor had a voice, you know, in this kind of decision making. But it was along those lines that leads into a kind of an idea or a perception of reality that's a kind of three-way thing. It almost brings together a kind of 3D look. It's a kind of way of seeing a non kind of linear reality. So it becomes, that's a kind of thing that's explored in that Scottish intellectual tradition. So that leads into William Hamilton, but also people like Clerk Maxwell, who is the only person that Einstein acknowledges. But it's that same way of being able of looking at reality. But the thing that became clear with George Davies' essays when he was being published in Edinburgh by the Edinburgh Students' Union, really, was because of the kind of a genuine democratic position was fundamental to it. It could not exist without that. It needed that level of that every human being counted. That was really that fundamental position, that the voice of every individual human being was absolutely necessary. Now that like, you can see where the humanism of Marx develops from there. Because that again is like one of the secrets of the alienation. It's not a secret, it becomes a secret, but to do with alienation. Because it's like ordinary human beings are alienated from what it is to be a human being, which would take freedom for granted, you know. But that kind of thing is like that thing to hold on to. That, in a sense, is what the alienation is, you know. So that in a sense was maintained during the 19th century, but in strange little ways. In Scotland, it became like the disruption of the church in 1943. Other people were fighting and dying for other causes, but in Scotland, they were, you know, the British state said, you need to take our ministers, and the Scottish Protestants said, no, we will choose our own ministers. So that ended up causing, that was the Scottish disruption, but that was actually a really good political position. It doesn't even get treated well. It should be. It was led by Thomas Chalmers, the great Thomas Chalmers and Hugh Miller. Anyway, yeah, who were really essential voices within that tradition. But it's just like that. What you become aware of, there's such a weight of information, knowledge around, and stuff that can actually be researched and looked at, you know. And in a way that shows the level of where the struggle is. It's like mammoth. At the same time, it's not something that I see it as being pretty exciting, because I'm aware that people are fighting in certain fronts and taking on issues in certain ways. I mean, John Cousins and Stacia Rice were in earlier, and I mean, more and more for me, because John and Stacia, because of what they have done with the Spirit of Revolt archive and those of us around from those early times of it, I see that now as the way ahead. At the moment, I don't see anything as like the archive is what is so fundamentally important. Whether it's here or down in London, you have the George Padmore Institute, so that young African English and people will be able to look at where their own stuff is coming from, their own radical history. So these, to me, radical history is a thing that really is where, by people actually looking at their own history, we see what the hell was happening. You know, the guy earlier on kind of made fun of me, mentioned Alice Fielding at the earlier meeting, and for anyone who regards their politics as libertarian to make fun of someone like Alice Fielding, I find it's actually shameful.
I think he didn't. He hadn't, hadn't heard of her.
But yeah, because he assumed that she was not someone he had to know because he didn't know of her already. The idea, again, because that position showed, that married the political position and the not necessarily a pacifist, but an anti-war position. Because when the shock stewards from the Clyde side, and that was all of them, like when they were actually deported from Scotland to England, and one of them was, of course, Arthur McManus, and Arthur, he was on the run, of course, because they were after him, because not only was he a friend of Maclean, he was a friend of James Connolly, and was like they all were, because again, it's all part of that history. Like, people don't even know Connolly was Scottish, for Christ's sake. I mean, the depth of ignorance is just so extraordinary. But that's the type of information, like Arthur McManus ends up meeting, he's on the run, so Alice Whelan puts him up and he meets Alice Whelan's daughter, and these two get married. And eventually Alice Whelan gets jailed, imprisoned and dies, and the family's destroyed by the British state. And there is the link, staring you right in the face, between the people who were on the Clyde, the workers there would not be conscripted because they were fundamental to the war effort working on the Clyde. But they were so fundamental that there was never any point where the British state did not worry about them. And not to be aware of that is just like, I just find that you can give it the benefit of the doubt and say it's extraordinary that people are not willing to look at that. I just find that. I mean, we look at people who spoke on the same platform in 1918. You've got Guy Aldred, Willie Gallagher, the Countess Thingway from Dublin. John, yeah, that's right. John S. Clark and all these people are speaking on the same platform. It's like, and why is Maclean not there? Because he's in prison, they're fucking killing him. Who's bothering? It's this type of unwilling to look at the reality of the situation. The older I get, the more astonished I am. Is like, why don't you look at what's in front of your nose? Why don't you walk down to some place and look at the conditions people are living in? Go down to the East End and look at where the Kurdish community are living, or how they're managing to survive and cope, or look at what happens if their community centre gets bust yet again, or blah blah blah.
But it's a lot of good. I mean, they talk about the 60s and stuff like that. I mean, you could get like the Beatles and all this. There's masses of innovation because you could do it on the dole. If you wanted to create a theatre group or something, all you needed was a joiner and somewhere, a good idea, plenty of empty premises and stuff like that. But now we're dealing with the internet and all manner of distraction, and speaking to people, it's impossible to get through to them in terms of this idea about even their local history or local campaigns that people should be, like you get great bus campaigns, you get live and rent campaigns, and these are all important things about people, because they're all busy paying their rent and they can't get in for Easter House and the buses. So there's a great campaign about regulating the buses or giving free buses. And live and rent, I mean, I was just looking at the thing in Ireland, there's about 3/4 of Ireland are in unions, the credit unions.
Yeah.
It's amazing, that amount of people. So you see these kind of elements, and these are things we could win. The bus campaign, we could win them. Because to try and engage people and get them into this further idea about history and stuff, we need to win something to show that what we're doing is worth, putting the effort into and stuff.
I don't actually think you've got to do anything. I mean, that's what I feel. All you have to do is make things available. To me, the beauty of the archive is it's there. It's not to try and go to people and say this is what you should do. I think what an archive can do occasionally depends on the archive. I mean, it's hard for like the National Library to do this kind of thing, but certainly the SOR or other ones do it. You can organise events based around what you have. It's possible to do that, but but it's asking too much of the people who are already doing it, because far too often the people who are doing it are volunteers anyway. So it's like, the last thing a volunteer needs is good ideas from somebody who isn't a volunteer. You know, you go, give us a break, you know. You go and do it if you think it's good, but I've got plenty of ideas of my own, but the people who are on the ground just now need my support, so I'm gaining my support, you know. And in a way, so even that, Bob, that position to me, simply because of my own kind of experiences, you're aware of a lot of young people who are really in difficult situations, and their only world, in a sense, is like online, and they can't be undervalued nor underestimated for what they're actually getting to grips with themselves and understanding. You know, you think again, going to a personal thing, my grandson's involvement with much to the amazement of his sister and all the women in the family was Andrew Tate. But, you know, I had felt at that time, well, he's going to kind of eventually see through him because of the world around him. He won't have to eventually have someone lecture him on fundamentalist Christianity masquerading as who knows what. It doesn't matter. But at the same time, that's a world that they're forced to live in, and they're going to come through if you give them a support. But the support is not by pushing them to go do this, that, and the next thing. And the other thing is they start to make their own kind of connections, and you know, you find out.
It's just making people aware that these things exist. You know, a lot of people don't know there's such a thing as living rent. And most of the time, we talk to young people and you can't get them engaging in because they've all got 2 jobs just to pay the rent. So they're dead important issues that people should involve. You're not sort of telling them that's what they should do, but you're saying if you want to get out of this situation, you're going to have to start winning things, or nobody's going to listen to you.
But they might be fighting their own battles. You don't know what.
Well, they are. That's what I'm saying. And one of the main ones is rent, paying the rent.
You know, I mentioned earlier, I was talking to Alan and Ewan there, but it's being aware of what people are actually having to cope with right now because of the deregulation that's going on right throughout, everywhere. My daughter is works in a form of welfare rights, because nowadays it's basically done by charities. But she told me there that she managed to get this thing. It was a beautiful thing. She'd been fighting a case for like a year for a guy who was being hammered by an energy company. The bill that he owed them was 8,000 quid. An ordinary guy. This is the kind of things that people who are involved in that type of job, like my daughter and others, and another daughter who's teaching young kids. I mean, genuinely, people who come to school with no food.
Mm.
You can't go to them and talk to them about another struggle. Imagine going up to their parents and saying, I've got this kind of struggle, I want you to hear about it. And you go, what are you talking about? You know, I mean, the daughter is a welfare rights worker. Well, she actually managed to win that case and get the energy company to no longer be forcing this family or guy to worry about this 8,000 quid. Or, you know, you go, for Christ's sake, man, what a victory that was. But these are what people on the ground are having to deal with now. And this is what's going on all over. And I can just, you like every individual human being, in a sense, you just double click on them. And each one, this wee folder for those of us involved in computing all the time, you know, then this wee folder, it's like this kind of tree diagram, one of Chomsky's tree diagrams or something. And there are all these people who are suffering. You know, like the other daughter's got 15 kids in a swimming pool up in Castlemilk. So 15 kids under like primary 6 or under or something like that. None of them can swim or whatever. The other teacher's under so much stress, she's dumped them all. And this girl, she's not a girl, but she's got to try and make sure they don't drown, try and teach 1 or 2, what shoe doesn't he slip, what shoe, this, that, the next thing. That's what people are having to face who are just in ordinary life just now. That there is no room for anything, really. And it's like, this is the way things have changed. In a way, it's like being aware of what is the reality just now. That's the reality. Like me and my wife not had a place to bloody live for months. That's what the reality is people are facing. You can't go to them and say, you know, well, it's really important that you take care of our struggle. You go, geez, I'm my fucking flitting, man. Come on, I'm 78, you know. Or you say, go and help this person who's got no electricity or who's got no food. Or that wee girl there's just, look at her story there. She weighs 2 stone or something like that. We're frogman flippers on. I mean, that's what's going on just now. You all go around and every single wee place, well, you know that from Govan, Bob, all around here, all these places are closed down, community. Oh, that place is closed down. What is that? Well, that used to be a community centre. You know, when we were around in the 60s and even the 70s, these were community centres, but did people not fight? Aye, they fought really hard, but they get beat. You know.
I think this is really important as well. Which is thinking about, like, say, your grandson who has been exposed to Andrew Tate, thinking he'll grow out of it or grow up and be exposed to other things. I've met a lot of younger people as well who they're totally lost in a world of gaming and they don't have a community, and the whole gaming community, especially, I don't know if you probably don't know what Gamergate, the Gamergate thing you told 10 years ago, where it became a kind of focus on misogynist kind of abuse about like women in the manosphere and in men's games. And this became a focus for intense sort of misogyny that's then been spread out into what could be called a kind of Christian national.
No, dead right.
Christian nationalism in the sense that, say, Franco or Salazar were Christian nationalists back in the 30s, a kind of a more tech bro kind of version of it. This is where so many young men think this way and been indoctrinated this way, and they don't have the community or the role or the real people that did meet in the past to take them away from it. It's really terrifying. There's
a really great point comes out of that I had wanted to raise. It's the other aspect of the PKK, the importance, in a sense, of the whole idea of clans and radical history, and what I would regard as the rise of fascism amongst working class people. I always find it like that. Normally, the Kurdish Russian, the Dunya, it's equidistant from the Loudon and the Bristol Bar. You know, and either side you've got like the far right masquerading as Rangers supporters, or vice versa. You know, this is a situation, but in order to try and find a way, right, we can't write off entire swathes of ordinary people, because they like even getting into the American South, or getting into, this will be the situation in former Yugoslavia. You're getting into things that are like, people are aware of that their own culture has now become meaningless. It's like being scoffed at and ridiculed and treated as like, ridiculed, treated with contempt and so on. And they've fought and died, and their forebears have fought and died. Not only their forebears, but guys they know personally, because like a couple of wee pals, maybe I know that, like from where I used to live. So their dad and their grandpas have brought them up in a blue nose, a loyalist tradition. So, and now that they're like hitting 20, they go to Belfast just for the march. And if I'm saying, well, where you go? I say, my grandson, oh, he'll say, oh no, he's away over to Belfast this weekend. I'll not be talking to him online. All right. Well, he plays the flute, and his dad plays drums, and Grandpa twirls the baton. But see, the fight is not to do with, you can scoff and go, oh, 1690. No, it's not to do with that. It's like what happened 3 weeks ago. So me and Shuey were there, and the cops came up and battered us. So we were there for Shuey. That happened to Shuey, and these guys set about him. So suddenly you're aware, like this thing that you thought and could have ridiculed or scorned as being some old history, isn't really an old history at all. You're going back to things like police brutality or the abuse or like how people are playing fast and loose with people's traditions and cultures and treating it like the way they used to treat Gaelic or something like that, or the way Celts were treated here, you know, or the way the Kurdish diaspora were treated throughout. You know, like this is not a real language. You know, what you treat is not a language at all. Or you know, blah 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 blah. All these issues that we're kind of familiar with in this country. You know, so that area is an area that once you start to try and kind of look at what's going on or take the rise of the right, try and get away of, don't call it fascism, because in a sense that's a label being put on by a more educated right wing or something. It's better looking at what is this kind of right wing position? What the hell? What is this that's going on with working class people? What is this? That why is it that they feel that blah blah blah, whatever it is, and you're back into certain issues that in a way, you know, you're aware of them. You're aware that these are issues that will have to be addressed at some point or another. How they get addressed, but these are big areas. It takes you back into diaspora politics and difficult.
I'm just listening to you. I'm thinking maybe people would mistake what you're saying, like the nuance that you're trying to build up for a kind of defeatism, and I really wouldn't want that to be the case.
Well,
but so that's maybe one provocation. But the other one is this question around, you know, you've been involved in many different groups and many different campaigns, but maybe to touch on this, on your experience of the Clydeside asbestos group, and how in terms of, you know, you're talking about how you're faced with the reality of something, you come together and you respond, and what happens through that response, because it's not just one moment, and then that lasts.
That's a very difficult. It's a really difficult issue. Again, you're on. It's one of these issues that people don't really want to know about, which is industrial disease. It's particularly bad when it's dealing with something like asbestos, because it is deadly and there's no cure for people who have asbestos-related conditions. And you have to find, so when you're dealing at that level, myself being involved in it as I was becoming involved in the advocacy side of it, because I wanted to get to know what the bloody situation really was. And that, as I've said in a kind of a book that will be published at some point, I hope, but it's doubtful. I felt at that time that I didn't really understand what the class struggle was until I became involved in the asbestos issue, or that struggle, was to realise how almost like every organ of state is designed to keep down the working class, every single one, and nowhere is it more apparent than in the struggle against industrial disease. And you could include accident and injury into it, and the forces that are against you involved in this, and the resources that the state is willing to spend to defeat a case if they think there is the least possibility of a precedent being given to someone who's died of, say, mesothelioma. A classic case that I was involved with, no backup from the trade union movement. They ran a mile from it. GMB ran a mile. GMB was mentioned today as if they were helpful. Oh, fuck's sake. They ran a mile from it. I was a school teacher that she was suffering mesothelioma when I was involved with her case, and she died a week before we won the case, or rather we won. Well, we did win the case. By that time, she was like, she was going. But the difficulty there was to win the case, you had to establish that she caught the disease while she was working. This was the whole problem. There was no question that she had mesothelioma and she was dying of it. But the difficulty is to prove it's an industrial disease. You have to establish that she contracted the disease while she was in her employment. So we were actually, the Clydeside action was pretty good at that. Again, people here, Tommy especially will not remember issues around that at the time when, but at that time it was different to what it is now. It wasn't a charity in these early days. It was, you could take on things like, we occupied City Chambers at one point. You could do things that were like not possible when you're a charity, really. That's why we would always have advocated never become a charity, because the first thing they do is take the politics away from you. You've really got to try and, stay like we were with both, with two instances. With Worker City, we took over the City Chambers, and with asbestos issue, we took over the City Chamber. Oh, these were massive struggles. But that, to do with the asbestos issue at that time, because you realise that every single issue there, you would never, it would never be used as a precedent. I sent off all the information on this, how this, yes, indeed it was an industrial disease, and anyone who worked in a hospital, if you've ever walked around underneath the Western Infirmary in those days, or the Royal Infirmary, go down to the very basic dungeon in the Royal, and look at all the asbestos stuff that's hanging off the ceiling. And then if you're a hospital porter or a nurse who's going through with a patient trying to save time, cutting through from the old to the new, if you end up with an asbestos-related disease, that's an industrial disease. You caught that while going to your work. But that was the precedent that the state, they actually spent, I thought we had won that case. And then I discovered a later event, they were challenging it. You think, why would the state challenge a decision made to award this woman's family a posthumous claim? But if you don't know that, I mean, other cases, people here might remember there was a classic case where, what was her name now? There was a case down in Cheltenham where two boys were fitted up for a racist murder. Mills and Poole, Gary Mills and this guy Poole. Gary Mills' brother, Gary Mills was in prison for 14 years. His ma was an absolute hero called Jeanette Mills, who I got to know. She came to a reading I was doing down in Cheltenham once. I'd won a fucking prize down there and she came here, a campaign. Now, the irony, after many years, after Gary had come out of prison, he got out of prison because eventually it was admitted by the state, no, he hadn't been involved in the murder, it was a fit-up. But lo and behold, the guys who fitted him up managed not to get charged. And anyway, the thing was that Jeanette's husband eventually contracted mesothelioma. He was involved in building the Royal Yacht Britannia, which was fully asbestos. Her man, I knew her husband as well. Now, the thing that happened with him, he was actually, see, his death certificate, on his death certificate was written, cause of death, mesothelioma, by a doctor. The state challenged that and overturned the verdict. Imagine why would they actually want to do that? Why would the state fight to overturn one doctor, and they sent in their own medical experts, their own doctors, to challenge that doctor, and all they had to find, because every industrial disease claim is settled in probability, civil law. So because of that, all they have to find is 51% proof to say something might not be possible. And that's what they did with Jeanette's her husband that died, you know, from mesothelioma. The state went in to overturn that. So once you get to grips with that kind of stuff, you realise that you never really understood how insidious the state is in terms of retaining that grip. You know, and it really is a lesson. You find an awful lot when you're involved in anti-racist struggles. But for me, again, there's like, maybe to do with diaspora politics again, but when it's to do with the working class disease, it's tricky when you're talking about diaspora politics here. You go more direct into radical history and so on because it's working class people who are supposed to be from your own culture. Stand up, we all believe in the Queen, or we all support the same God, you know. It's trickier, and you're left with this kind of contempt, really. It's really what I was left with, contempt for the lawyers. And eventually it became so bad that, you know, I was actually named by a lawyer in the Glasgow Herald. Again, it was also like, how dare you? You know, how dare you challenge us or take us? Well, this is what you did, you know. You know, that again, that was to do with somebody, that was Pat McChrystal, another asbestos issue. A guy took him on when he was dying of mesothelioma, and he fought the campaign, this guy, Pat McChrystal, with the group, you know, because he refused to take the money. And he was offered, like, his lawyer he was getting offered 18,000 quid. And he came to the group. You remember Bert Connors, Tommy?
Yeah.
He came to the group, they've offered us 18,000, what will I do? Saturday morning it was. Funny how these things always happened on a Saturday. So we were all sitting in the office. Bert's in the middle way, tell me fuck off. Well, I make a phone call, son. It was a really great moment. So anyway, but eventually, like about 4 days later, the offer came back, 50,000 quid. We'll give you 50,000. I'm not taking that either. Don't you realise I've got mesothelioma? What good's, I'm not married, I've got, my niece is around, but why would I take, I'm not interested in no, don't talk, there's no point talking about no. Well, what do you want to do? Well, we're going to court. We want to get it out in the open, what's going on here. And maybe with a bit of luck, if we get it out in the open, there'll be a cop sitting in the public gallery who'll go, maybe I can charge him with a crime. If he's already admitted to killing you, because he's killing you, isn't he? He's killing me. He knew he was putting me to work in asbestos, and now here I am. So that was actually, because that's what we did the homework, you know. We knew what went on in Australia and what went on in the States. And we knew about what they call punitive damages. You get that in these, like, you know, that Erin Brockovich, you know, it's not to do, the real way you end the problem is because of what they call punitive damages. In the UK, they call it exemplary damages. It means that the judge has discretion to say, well, I think what you did is despicable and I'm going to fine you like 30 million quid. Whereas the UK have got it sewn up. You don't get exemplary damages or punitive damages. Here, all you ever get is like various, how much have you lost by not going to your work? You know, so it's all based on that kind of straightforward way. So 50,000, the older you are, you'll not get 50,000, you're 65. If you're 45, you'll get 70,000. But, you know, so it's based on that kind of thing. So eventually it was the lawyers that told us and the union. They said, well, when we got to High Court to take this case to the limit, the lawyer came, the trade union, the lawyer came and said, "I'm sorry, there's your guy there," and the QC was running up with the headmaster's cloak on and he's wigging that. He wouldn't even talk to us. He would like, he'd tell one of the underlings, the lawyers, the solicitors, "He's going to not take your case, What do you mean? He's not taking your case any longer. Why not? Well, because he doesn't know how much, you might not win their case. It was such a stitch up. The guy was on $3,000 a day. That's what QC's earned in 1990, 1991, minimum. So it was such a stitch up that here was a guy who only had a couple of months to live, who was being told that they were sticking a boot into him for that. And that was what they did. And the GMB were responsible because, and at a certain point, it's like, you don't want people being, taking the wrong thing about what I'm saying about the loyalists or something like that. When you're involved in that, you can understand the arguments, right? So I could understand the GMB's position because I'm a trade unionist. You can understand their position because they're going, look, we can't back you because if you lose, you've got to remember, this guy is not the lawyer's client. He's a member of our trade union. We're the client. If you lose, it's not him that loses, it's us. And because of what had happened with that in 1979 government, they were destroying the trade union movement. By this time, they'd already put these things in place to make the trade union itself responsible for certain financial burdens, because they knew that it would put them out of business. I mean, everything was so kind of coherent or consistent, And again, that's me like getting back to the reality of it. You had to explain to people, look, this is a hard thing to swallow, but you have to realise this is a situation. In order to fight on any further, you've got to be prepared to do this. And if you aren't prepared to do that, then, it's like they would say in a very difficult anti-racist struggle, you would end up, people would say if somebody had been killed through an anti-racist killing, you would have to actually say to the people involved, the family, I'm sorry, but if you're not involved, there is no campaign. But there isn't a campaign unless you're, which is what happened with Stephen Lawrence's campaign, because we were also very strong up here, in terms of campaigning. One of our campaign nights in 1993 was only a few months after Stephen was murdered, and we held it in McCool's pub, a big event down there, and that kind of was a great thing for the Stephen Lawrence family. I mean, it really was, and that was something that they accepted. In order for the campaign to move forward, they had to become personally involved in it, which is exactly what happened. The family got, and that was what happened with that campaign. But that's one of those hard lessons, like in terms of almost every life or death campaign. If the people themselves don't get involved, then that's part of what. That's why that again, I always point over this to do with the PKK example. It was a great example that you were talking about and not picked up properly in terms of self-defence and so on. So that's what families, that's what people have to deal with, There is nothing if you don't do it. If you don't do it, nobody can do it for you, Okay.
I think that's a great note to end on, because we're at time. An hour and a half.
Excellent.
Flew by. I hope we can get a chance to read the Asbestos book soon. It's just a wish.
Yeah. Well, especially finished it, but it may be what do you call it, an e-book. But I don't think it'll be out, I don't think it'll be published, but it'll be an e-book.
We can read e-books. Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for coming. See you at the next one.
Right.